As corporate conduct reaches new lows, whistleblowers are playing a more and more important role in exposing corporate crimes. But corporations are fighting back hard, and retaliation against whistleblowers is now at an all-time high. Joining me now to talk about this is attorney Chris Paulos. Chris, the False Claims Act was put in place well over a century ago, and it was basically put there so that whistleblowers could come forward, expose fraud within their company, be it against the federal government or against consumers, and not have a fear of retaliation. And so today, 2015, the False Claims Act is under attack. Give us a quick overview of what the False Claims Act really provides for workers.
Farron, you're absolutely right. The False Claims Act has been around for over 100 years, since the Civil War. It's commonly referred to as Lincoln's Law. And what was going on back then is that government contractors were bilking the government of tax dollars, of dollars from the Treasury, for things that the Union Army needed. They were paying for gunpowder, but only getting sacks of flour and sawdust. They were paying for horses, and they were getting dilapidated mules. And people would come forward and report this to the government, and in return receive a bounty or a portion of whatever was recovered from these fraudsters. And the law has been in existence since then. It has been reinvented or reinvigorated in 1986 and has been used since then to recover billions of dollars on behalf of the government when corporations like healthcare companies, pharmaceutical companies, military contractors, and others have been found to have submitted false claims against the government for things as far as pharmaceutical drugs, for scientific testing, for bulletproof vests and Humvees that are used in Iraq and Afghanistan. Just all sorts of fraud can be addressed through the False Claims Act.
So this law that's been in place for close to 150 years at this point, been strengthened roughly one time, maybe two or three times before that, marginally. But so in the 80s, gets a little bit more teeth. But today, what we're seeing is corporations are going out there. We're seeing more misconduct and fraud against the government, fraud against consumers, than really at any other point in history since probably the Civil War. They're not selling, sacks of flour to the government anymore, but what they're doing is they're selling junk bonds, or they're marking up Medicare codes that don't actually exist, saying that they perform services on a patient when they really didn't do this. It's the same thing, just got a new name at this time. But this law that's put in place to protect these workers or to give them incentive to come forward, corporations are now fighting back against those employees who dare come forward and, oh my God, tell the truth and say, look, my company is doing some bad things. You guys have to step in and do something. And those employees are the ones who are being punished. Tell us what's happening.
Okay, so you're right. The law has been strengthened. And the reason that the government has strengthened this law is that the government realizes that the number one tool in preventing fraud against the Treasury are whistleblowers. It's not the companies themselves. It's not the crooks that are going to turn themselves in. And these are very sophisticated crooks. And the schemes that they come up with are very, very complex. And they're hard to detect. And oftentimes, the only way that the government can ever learn about these is somebody learning about that from within a company or within an entity, or discovering the fraud on their own accord and stepping forward. And oftentimes, they're stepping forward at great risk to themselves. The bravery that these whistleblowers in the past that we have seen, that they've demonstrated, is extraordinary. They risk their personal lives, they risk their careers, they risk their reputations, and they come forward and they report fraud to the government. And that's why this law has been strengthened in the past, was to provide incentives for people to do that and to provide protections, that is anti-retaliation provisions for whistleblowers. So if they do step forward and report their own company for some fraudulent wrongdoing, they can't be sacked, they can't be blackballed, they can't be steamrollered by this company, and they can't be silenced. And now, after so many years of having a very effective law on the books, these same companies, these companies that have been found in violation of the law, these companies that have had their own employees turn them into the government for egregious wrongdoing, are attacking the very law that they've been found in violation of. They want to take the teeth out of it. They want to remove retaliation provisions. They want to allow the companies themselves to report violations and thereby basically govern themselves. And I think what we can see is what happens when we allow corporations or folks to govern themselves. What happens? The financial crisis of 2008, the loosening of regulations on the banking industry. What has that resulted in? Egregious and rampant fraud and near economic collapse. And so, like you said, these attacks that this law is experiencing are designed to allow the law to fail and not to make it perform any better.
And it's worth pointing out that these attacks, the largest group out there is the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and their so-called Institute for Legal Reform. And this Institute for Legal Reform is essentially the group that came up with the concept of tort reform. They went around, they've been selling this for years. They are the ones who created the image of lawyers as ambulance chasers. Those were well-developed talking points that they developed over years and years, sold to the American public, and caused a huge decline in the way the American public views attorneys. And so now they've already demonized the entire law profession. So now they're going after the laws themselves. The Institute for Legal Reform, which is funded by healthcare companies, pharmaceutical companies, and as you pointed out too, military defense contractors, the three main groups that are guilty of fraud against the government, they're going in there, they're trying to take out this law, and they want companies to just say, look, everybody's on the honor system here. We're not going to do anything illegal, and if we do, don't worry, we're going to report it to you. I mean, has that ever worked out in the past when companies say, oops, we did something wrong, go ahead, we need to pay you this fine? Do they ever willingly come forward and say these things to the government?
Exactly, Farron. They want people to believe that they're going to be good corporate citizens and turn themselves in, potentially have to force themselves to pay billions of dollars in statutory fines for the conduct that they knowingly or gladly turned a blind eye to. So it's almost laughable what the chamber is wanting to do with the False Claims Act. They're basically saying that because the False Claims Act can't recover every dollar of fraud in existence, that it should be completely dismantled. But what they're not recognizing is that only through external enforcement can these companies be held accountable. We can't trust them to turn themselves in if they discover a multi-billion-dollar fraud within their own company. And what they want to do is not only do they want to tort reform or limit the ability of a private individual, that is their own employees or a whistleblower, to go to court and to rectify the wrongs that they may commit and to prevent people from having their day in court and to make it incredibly expensive to ever bring a case against them. But now they want to basically water down this law. They want to create some sort of sliding scale of liability where, depending on how culpable they are, their fines would be adjusted commensurate with that, which is ridiculous. You either broke the law or you didn't, and you should pay the penalty or you shouldn't. You shouldn't have some sort of sliding scale that you can adjust yourself and then raise your hand and tell the government that, hey, we owe you some money, we just discovered this. Oh, and by the way, it's really not as bad as it looks because we took care of it ourselves.
Corporate fraud is essentially the largest industry in America. $72 billion every single year in corporate fraud against the government and U.S. consumers. And if they are given the ability to police themselves, you can expect that $72 billion figure to go up. Chris Paulos, thank you so much for telling us this story today.